In this episode of Motive Tech, we look at what it really takes to swap out your RB26 block for an RB30 in your GTR. The topic of doing an RB30 block swap in your GTR has been discussed thousands of times on internet forums and Facebook groups and all sorts of places. Now, I obviously know a lot of workshops, car owners and mechanics that have done the RB30 conversion, and I thought that I knew everything I needed to know about doing an RB30 swap. But guess what? I didn't know everything I needed to know. Now, why is that? Well, when you talk to a workshop that's done a heap of RB30 swaps, they'll tell you, oh yeah, it's easy, just this and this. But you've got to remember, they've done it heaps of times. So in their head, it actually is pretty easy. But if you've never done it before, it actually is a little bit more challenging at times than you think. And the other reason I often miss out on the info is a lot of them are fresh builds from scratch. So you don't find out all the little differences that you have if you're just swapping the block over. So I've decided to share my experience with putting an RB30 block into our R32 GTR while keeping the same head and bolt-ons around that block. Now, the other discussion around RB30 blocks is, should you go RB30? Because capacity is king, right? Well, maybe, maybe not. Some people argue they love big RPM, and some people argue they love the sound of an RB26 versus an RB30. Now, I will say this, you can have capacity and big RPM. Goat 32 and Jun 2 from CID rev past 11,000 RPM. So the whole idea that a 3 litre or a 3.2 won't rev is just quite simply ridiculous. Now, it is true though that with a factory RB30 crank, they do have bad harmonics, therefore they don't want to rev as hard. That can be remedied with some treatment, and some people are going to argue with me that RB30 cranks can do more RPM than that, but based on the experience I have, RB30s don't really like to rev as hard as a stock 26 crank, and obviously nowhere near as much as the billet cranks. Now, the other thing you have to remember why people say they don't rev is all of your power band simply moves down when you increase capacity. So it has more low down torque, more mid-range, but loses some top end, but probably still makes the same power, and it will do it on less boost. So this is a non-stop argument, this whole sound, RPM, drivability, torque, etc. And you know what? I'm going to stay out of it because, well, I'm going to be revving my 3.2 past 9,000 RPM. So I'm going to have RPM and I'm going to have torque from all that extra capacity. So let's take a look at all the little things and the big things that we had to go through to put an RB30 into our GTR. First, let's start with the long block. We've shown in previous videos the prep work that went into our block, but let's look at just what the RB30 swap requires. The RB30 block doesn't have annular grooves around the main bearings. For big horsepower, it's a good idea to have them machined in. It's not essential for the swap, but strongly recommended. On NA blocks, the turbo oil feed looks like it's there, but often needs to be drilled through to the gallery onto the other side of the block, so make sure you check whether that goes through. Some also need to be drilled for the turbo oil drain return line. RB30s have a thread straight onto the block for the oil filter, which you can use if you like, but if you want to use your RB26 sandwich plate or factory oil cooler, you need to swap the threaded stud for a smooth one like we did to use the JHH oil distribution block. To attach the RB26 sump with the front diff in it, you need a four-wheel drive adapter, or even better, a four-wheel drive brace like from Platinum Racing products, which not only adapts to four-wheel drive, but helps stop main cap walk and resist block twisting. The head studs need to be increased in size from 11mm to 12mm to match the RB26 head. Some people change both to 1/2 inch. We stayed 12mm to maximise deck strength. With the long block assembled, the next thing to do is tackle the timing belt and pulleys. Series 1 and Series 2 blocks are different. On the Series 1 block, you need to buy an adapter, like from PRP, to help mount the second pulley. Gates make a timing belt kit to suit with the longer belt. Next, the timing cover will now be 50mm too short and won't match up with your top timing cover. If you don't run a top timing cover, it doesn't really matter. But if you do, then a TAH Products item is your best bet, as it has the extra height to make it match up.
The aircon and alternator brackets all bolt up fine from your RB26, but the power steering bracket from the RB26 won't go straight on. One of the tabs needs to be cut or machined down to suit the RB30 block. Once that is done, the bracket and pump go on fine.
So that's all of the things that you need to do to the long motor before it goes into the car. But you do need to do a couple of things to the car itself to prepare for the RB30 block to go in. Now, the first one that is highly recommended to do is a clutch booster delete. Now, if you have the factory inlet manifold on an RB30, it will fit, but there's not a lot of room. But once you go to aftermarket manifolds and stuff like that, a lot of them hit the factory clutch master cylinder. So we installed a PRP clutch booster delete. It's exactly what it says. It gets rid of the actual booster for the clutch and just has a normal clutch master cylinder, an S15 one, that bolts straight on to an adapter and then a braided clutch line down. So it actually makes your clutch simpler and gives you more clearance for aftermarket manifolds. The other thing we did to our car to prepare it for the RB30 is we put in some PRP 7mm subframe spacers. Basically, they slip in between the subframe and the body of the car and move the subframe down, which obviously lowers the height of the engine in the engine bay. 7mm doesn't sound like a lot, but sometimes that's all you need for the bonnet clearance that you take care of at the end. On the flip side of that, though, is when you space a subframe, you are messing with your suspension geometry and alignment. Now, if you're building a street drag style car or a street car, it's probably not a big issue, but for circuit, probably wouldn't do it. What we are finding, though, is that when you put those spacers in, you are affecting your bump steer and your roll center. Now, we have a GK Tech 20mm roll center adjuster that's already in there, so that will pretty much offset that. But we are finding now with this car, we are getting more bump steer. So we are going to install some aftermarket tie rod ends, which I strongly recommend to do if you put an RB30 in the car and space down the subframe. The next thing to think about is the gearbox. Now, when you put a four-wheel drive adapter plate or a brace in between the sump and the block, the gearbox holes on the bottom no longer line up with the sump. Now, you can weld or machine or drill out and do whatever you want to do to make them fit, but I'll be honest with you, there are a lot of 7-second GTRs that use 4 gearbox bolts that bolt the engine to the box, but they don't bolt to the sump anymore. Is it wrong? Is it dangerous? Does it work? Decide for yourself. You guys, I'm sure, will argue in all the comments section, but I will say this, plenty of 7-second GTRs run 4 gearbox bolts. So that's what you need to do to get the car ready for the engine to go in. So let's have a look at all the little things that we had to change on our R32. Now, everything we've spoken about so far, you have to do to your long block or your GTR, regardless of whether it's a fresh build or whether it's just a swap over block style build. Now, if you do a fresh build, you're going to fabricate everything new and you're going to buy all the parts suited to an RB3026, such as exhaust manifolds, etc. So you're going to fabricate everything where it needs to fit. But if you're like us and you had an RB26 in before and you swapped to RB30 block, a lot of little things are going to change. Now, we knew what some of the big things would be that changed, but there was actually a lot of little things we didn't know about that caught us out during our build. I'm going to share all of those with you. Now, firstly, the exhaust manifold with the turbocharger. Now, if you had low mounts or you've got a medium frame turbo, quite often it will still fit the same in the engine bay. It just sits higher. Now, we've got a 6-boost manifold to suit a G35, and we were able to keep that manifold. Now, if we had a G42 or a Pro Mod or something else like that, we would need a different manifold. Now, I can't say this is the same for every manifold out there, but for a 6-boost G35 manifold, you can use the same manifold. Now, the turbo might sit in the same spot relative to the head, and it sits higher, so it might hit the bonnet depending on your bonnet. But the next thing is the dump pipe. Now, because the block height is 50 mil higher, as you can imagine, the dump pipe now needs to be longer to meet up to the exhaust. So we had to cut and shut our dump pipe to make it longer to fit back up. Now, the external wastegate wasn't an issue, but we did actually find that the way we had our wastegate orientated previously, the fittings on it, when we moved it, actually then hit on one of the suspension upper control arm bolts. So we had to muck around with the fittings on our wastegate to actually get it to clear where it sits up against the inner wheel arch inside the car. So it was just one of those fluke things where it fit perfectly fine before, you move it up 50 mil, and now it was hitting on something. So we had to put new fittings on it, slightly change the orientation of the wastegate. Coming out of the turbo, the intercooler pipe on this side, we thought we'd have to change it, but we got really lucky. The intercooler pipe actually went back on. There was probably just enough give in the silicon hoses and the alignment, etc. Our intake pipe, we had to modify that ever so slightly just to angle it down a little bit, make it a bit shorter, just because of where the turbo moved. Moving around to the front, the radiator was actually our next issue because when the water pump pulley moved up, it actually fouled against the back of our thermofan. Had plenty of clearance before, but not anymore. So to get some extra clearance, what we did is we actually folded the back edge of the radiator support, which actually gives you about an extra 8 to 10 mil extra clearance to move the top of the radiator forward a little bit. However, the chain reaction of that is I then had to fabricate new radiator brackets so it would actually sit in the right spot, but that gave us our clearance. And the other thing you have to look at is radiator pipes. Because obviously the height of the engine has changed, the radiator pipe from the radiator to the engine is obviously could end up being slightly the wrong shape. Now, because we moved the radiator, we actually ended up being able to use an off-the-shelf radiator pipe. But if we kept the radiator in the same spot, we might have had to trim the radiator pipe a little bit for better fitment. Now, on the driver's side, we had to fabricate an all-new intercooler pipe. It was nowhere near fitting at all, because you have to remember the RB26 sits on an angle. So that extra 50 millimeters isn't straight up, it's actually straight up and off to the passenger side. So that means the intercooler pipe on this side was nowhere near fitting. Underneath, we did have a few issues with little things like some of the wires now didn't reach, a piece of loom wouldn't go into a bracket anymore. Just, you've got to look out for little things like that when you're doing the RB30 swap. Something a lot of people don't pick up on straight away is the top of the engine is now higher, so sometimes the way that you've run your breather lines, they may not fit exactly where you want them anymore. These used to sit perfectly flush right up against the throttle bracket, but now they don't because they have to travel that little bit further. Another thing is we had to make a new line to the brake booster because obviously the engine sits higher. The factory one had a shape to it. It no longer fit on anymore. So as you can see, there's just a lot of little small things you have to take into consideration when you're doing the 30 swap. But like I said, if you're fabricating from scratch, not a big deal. The final thing to talk about is bonnet clearance. Now, if you don't put the subframe spacers in, will a factory bonnet clear the RB30? Some people have said yes, but almost every time I've seen it, people have had to trim little bits of the webbing inside. You don't need to cut a hole in the bonnet, but you'll need to trim some webbing. The other thing that determines your bonnet clearance is, are you running a top timing cover or not? If you have the top timing cover, then you have even less clearance up against the bonnet. But if you don't run it, your next thing that's going to hit is the front of your rocker cover. Now, if you have a vented bonnet that's like a Z-tune style bonnet, you can trim that pretty easily to clear. But unfortunately, our bonnet, the negative pressure duct actually droops back into the engine bay, and we're finding the top of our cam cover right at the front is just rubbing on the inside of the bonnet. It's not a lot, and because of the stiff engine mount, it's not really a major concern. But the easiest way to get rid of that problem, and why you see a lot of them, is just to run the billet low profile cam covers. People obviously get rid of the backing plate as well, and that gives you heaps more clearance for your cam covers. So if you don't want to cut your bonnet, you don't want to be mucking around too much, the low profile cam covers really are the way to go. But personally, I love the look of 26 covers, but I might change. The other problem you have is the shape of the bonnet at the back, where that bulge is before you get up to the cowl at the bottom of the window, will often hit on your breathers. So we had to cut this section out here so that the breather on the driver's side will actually sit up inside that hole there to get the clearance. So yeah, can a bonnet clear? It can. Do you have to modify it? It's all going to come down to what fittings you use, what cam covers you got, whether you've got a timing cover. So there isn't a straight black and white answer for bonnet clearance, but there are plenty of cars out there running a factory bonnet that isn't raised at the back or anything silly like that, and they've just clearanced the ribbing on the inside a little bit, and they still have a timing cover. So it can be done, but you have to work out your specific application. Overall, it wasn't overly difficult to do, but you just need to keep some of those little things in the back of your mind for when you do the RB30 swap. The next big argument about the RB30 swap is, how much extra grunt and drivability does it add to a GTR? Well, you can watch our Motive Garage features on this car to find out.